There is a kind of man who doesn't shout his suffering, doesn't make grand gestures or wage wars. Instead, he sits in silence, curled deep inside his own mind, endlessly dissecting every thought, every intention, every perceived failure. He is not a villain. He's not a hero. He's something far more unsettling. He's a man who has become a stranger to himself. And this man, Fyodor Dostoevsky, warned us, is a mirror, not of the past, but of our future. Have you ever caught yourself thinking too much about something so small that you ended up paralyzed? Have you replayed conversations in your mind for days, regretting both what you said and what you didn't heat tea? Have you felt both superior and ashamed of yourself at the same time? Then perhaps you've met the underground man, not out there in the world, but somewhere inside your own head. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, published in 1864, is not just a novel. It's a psychological X-ray. It peels back the polite layers of modern man and exposes something raw, something festering. The underground man is petty, contradictory, brilliant, cruel, self-aware, and yet helpless. He mocks the very idea of progress and questions whether reason truly leads to happiness. And while his words might seem dated, the warning he carries has only grown louder in our time. Today, we live in an age of infinite information and relentless self-awareness. We curate our identities online, pursue optimization at all costs, and worship at the altar of rationality. Yet beneath this surface, many are quietly unraveling. Anxiety, depression, paralysis by analysis, they're no longer fringe experiences. They're everyday realities. The underground man, once a prophetic shadow, is now sitting beside us in cafes, scrolling through feeds, questioning his own existence between dopamine hits and existential dread. Dostoevsky didn't invent this character out of thin air. He was observing the trajectory of a society obsessed with logic, progress, and the mechanical perfection of man. He saw the cracks forming in the foundation long before the rest of the world did. And instead of proposing a solution, he offered something far more unsettling, a portrait of a man lost in the echo chamber of his own mind. In this exploration, we'll journey through time, tracing the roots of this fractured self. We'll look at how ancient cultures saw identity and contradiction, how psychology today names the very struggles the underground man embodied, and how each of us still wrestles with the paradox of freedom, the terror of consciousness, and the silent rebellion against being just another predictable machine. So ask yourself, when you sit in silence and start to spiral, whose voice is it that speaks? And if you listen closely, does it sound anything like the underground man? Are you ready to meet him? To understand the underground man, we have to step back, not just into 19th century Russia, but further, into the long evolution of how human beings have wrestled with consciousness, contradiction, and identity. Dostoevsky didn't create this man out of creative impulse alone. He distilled centuries of philosophical tension into one deeply conflicted voice. And in doing so, he connected ancient anxieties with the growing fractures of the modern age. Let's begin with the time and place where this character emerged. Russia, in the mid-1800s, was a nation caught between old-world mysticism and the rising tide of Western rationalism. The Enlightenment had spread its glow across Europe, championing reason, progress, and the infallibility of science. Humans, it was argued, could be perfected through logic, through systems, through the meticulous arrangement of laws and institutions. Utopian thinkers proposed blueprints for the ideal society. If only man could be guided like a machine, programmed to behave correctly, all suffering could be eliminated. But Dostoevsky had seen too much suffering to believe in such optimism. He had watched ideas become dogmas, and dogmas become prisons. As a young man, he was arrested and sentenced to death for his political beliefs. At the last moment, the execution was staged as a mock punishment, meant to psychologically shatter the prisoners. And it did. The trauma stayed with him for life. After years in a Siberian labor camp, Dostoevsky returned a changed man, spiritually awakened, but inwardly tormented. He no longer believed that humanity could be saved through intellect alone. It was in this context that he wrote Notes from Underground. The novella is short, yet it is layered with philosophical dynamite. Its narrator is unnamed. We know only that he is 40 years old, retired, living in St. Petersburg, and drowning in his own hyperconsciousness. He mocks the idea that man will become rational and predictable. He rebels not with violence, but with sarcasm, self-loathing, and erratic behavior. The book was a direct response to the utopian thinkers of Dostoevsky's time, especially Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who had written a novel called What Is to Be Done, in which man is portrayed as a rational creature who, when enlightened, will always act in his best interest. In contrast, the underground man spits on this idea. He argues that sometimes, precisely because we are told what is rational and right, we will choose the opposite. Not out of stupidity, but out of defiance, out of a deeper, darker freedom. But this rebellion is not new. It echoes through history. In ancient Greece, the philosophers divided over human nature. Socrates and Plato believed in the supremacy of reason, the idea that truth and goodness could be uncovered through dialectic and reflection. But there were skeptics, like the sophists, who saw man as a creature of persuasion and passion more than logic. Fast forward to early Christianity, and we find a deep ambivalence about human nature. Augustine of Hippo spoke of the inner war between the spirit and the flesh, between the higher will and the lower desires. Even when we know what is good, he wrote, we do not always do it. Sin, contradiction, and inner chaos were seen not as anomalies, but as fundamental truths of the human condition. Dostoevsky absorbed all of this, but he added something new. He placed contradiction at the center of consciousness itself. The underground man is not merely torn between good and evil, or reason and emotion. He is fractured even in his rebellion. He wants to be free, but he resents the suffering that freedom brings. He wants to love, but he sabotages his relationships. He mocks society, but he craves its approval. He hates himself for conforming and for failing to conform. In the centuries leading up to Dostoevsky, especially during the Enlightenment, there was a rising belief that man could be perfected, that progress was inevitable, that suffering was a problem to be solved, not a mystery to be understood. But this belief came at a cost. It ignored the irrational parts of our psyche. It denied the part of us that says no. No to reason. No to happiness. No to predictability. The underground man becomes a spokesperson for that neglected part, the part that refuses to be tamed. He is a spiritual cousin of Hamlet, another man paralyzed by thought. But unlike Hamlet, who acts in bursts, the underground man retreats further and further into himself. His rebellion is not loud, it is internal, and that makes it more insidious, more modern. In many ways, the underground man prefigures the existential thinkers of the 20th century. Sartre, Camus, and Kierkegaard would later echo many of his concerns: the absurdity of life, the burden of freedom, the nausea of too much self-awareness. But Dostoevsky got there first, and he did it not through dry theory but through character, through the inner voice of a man who knows exactly what he is and hates himself for it. Even in non-Western traditions, we find resonances of this conflict. In Sufi mysticism, there's the concept of the nafs, the lower self, which resists divine order and clings to pride, ego, and contradiction. The Sufi path involves confronting this self, not through denial, but through transformation. But what happens when the self becomes so fragmented that even transformation feels impossible? This is the state of the underground man. He is not merely resisting change, he is so aware of himself that he dismantles any attempt to improve. He calls out his own lies before anyone else can. He anticipates every judgment, every critique, and neutralizes them with irony. But this defense is also his prison. In the end, what makes the underground man so haunting is not how different he is from us, but how familiar, He is what happens when we overthink freedom, when we turn reflection into paralysis, when we distrust every motive, every action, until only emptiness remains. He is the shadow that grows when progress forgets the soul. And so, through this fractured man in a dark basement in St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky sent a warning, not just to the intellectuals of his time, but to us, to every society that believes it can outthink the human condition, to every person who has ever felt trapped inside their own mind. The underground man is not just a character, he is a prophecy, and we are living in the world he foresaw. When Dostoevsky gave voice to the underground man, he wasn't just creating a literary figure. He was articulating what modern psychology would later recognize as a deeply fractured psyche. The brilliance of Notes from Underground lies in its uncanny anticipation of psychological patterns that would not be formally named until nearly a century later. The underground man is not only a character study but a psychological diagnosis etched in narrative. Let's begin by examining the core trait that defines him: hyper-consciousness. The underground man suffers from an excessive awareness of his own thoughts, motives, and contradictions. He cannot simply feel. He must analyze the feeling, doubt its authenticity, question its origin, then punish himself for having it. This hyper-awareness creates a kind of mental claustrophobia, a suffocating feedback loop of observation and judgment. In psychological terms, this resembles rumination, a central feature in anxiety and depression. Rumination is the process of endlessly thinking about problems, perceived failures, or emotional wounds without reaching any resolution. It masquerades as insight but rarely produces clarity. The more the underground man thinks, the less he acts. He becomes paralyzed by his own introspection, sabotaging opportunities for connection, change, or redemption. But why do we ruminate? Modern psychology tells us that excessive self-focus often arises from shame and a fragile sense of identity. Psychologist Carl Rogers described how individuals build a self-concept based on perceived acceptance. When that acceptance is threatened, some withdraw into themselves, creating an internal labyrinth of overthinking as a defense. The underground man embodies this perfectly. He believes he's too intelligent to participate in life, too proud to conform, and too ashamed to ask for love. He hides behind his intellect while longing for human connection. This links us to a broader concept in social psychology: the divided self. Philosopher and psychologist William James spoke of the I and the me, the self as subject and the self as object. Most people navigate life fluidly between these poles. But the underground man is stuck in the me, the observer role, constantly evaluating himself from a distance. This detachment breeds not wisdom, but alienation. We can also view him through the lens of existential psychology, especially as framed by thinkers like Rollo May and Viktor Frankl. Existential psychology deals with themes like meaning, freedom, isolation, and responsibility. The underground man is painfully aware of his own freedom, but instead of embracing it, he resents it. He mocks determinism, then wishes he could be determined. He loathes the idea of being a cog in a system, but he's terrified of true independence. In short, he is in rebellion not against oppression, but against the burden of choice. This echoes what Søren Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom, a state where the infinite possibilities of choice overwhelm the individual, producing anxiety instead of liberation. Kierkegaard believed that to become truly free, one must make authentic choices in the face of uncertainty. But the underground man avoids this at all costs. He hides in the cracks between action and thought, between pain and pretense. Let's now look at how narcissism enters the picture, not in the inflated, grandiose way we usually imagine, but in the more covert, vulnerable form. The underground man does not boast about his greatness. Rather, he performs his suffering, exaggerates his flaws, and positions himself as tragically misunderstood. He lashes out not because he feels superior, but because he feels unseen. In modern clinical terms, we might even see traces of vulnerable narcissism, where low self-esteem is hidden behind a facade of intellectual superiority or emotional depth. But this leads to a paradox. By obsessing over how he appears to others, the underground man never truly relates to anyone. He reduces relationships to games of domination and humiliation. When he interacts with Liza, the prostitute, he oscillates between cruelty and self-pity. He wants to save her, then debases her. He begs for her love, then rejects it when it's offered. It's not that he doesn't know what he's doing. He knows too well. But knowledge doesn't set him free. It becomes another weapon he uses against himself. This dynamic bears striking resemblance to attachment theory, particularly the avoidant and disorganized styles. Individuals with disorganized attachment often crave intimacy but fear it at the same time. Their early emotional needs may have been met inconsistently or with pain, leading them to see closeness as both desirable and dangerous. The underground man craves validation, yet when someone reaches toward him, he recoils. He lives in the terrifying space between the desire to be loved and the fear of being known. Let's add a final psychological layer. Self-sabotage. The underground man undermines every chance he has at happiness. Not because he believes he doesn't deserve it, but because happiness would collapse his narrative. He defines himself through suffering. Take that away, and who would he be? We all do this to some degree. We cling to stories that no longer serve us, because changing them would require the death of the self we've come to know. He reminds us that the ego can choose misery over transformation if it believes that misery keeps it safe. But we must also acknowledge the spiritual dimension. In Jungian terms, the underground man represents a fragmented ego that refuses to integrate the shadow. Jung warned that without acknowledging the darker aspects of ourselves, we project them outward or become consumed by them. The underground man doesn't just deny his shadow, he cultivates it. He romanticizes it. He builds his identity around it. He is the shadow personified. Intelligent, bitter, detached, deeply lonely. This insight is mirrored in Sufi teachings. In the Sufi path, the lower self, the nafs, must be transcended through surrender, humility, and spiritual practice. But the underground man does the opposite. He clings to pride, mocks humility, and sneers at faith. And yet, beneath his arrogance is a kind of spiritual despair. He wants to believe in something greater, but he's terrified it might require him to let go of control. He is both the jailer and the prisoner. So, what does all this mean for us? The psychological richness of the underground man isn't confined to fiction. He is a composite of traits that many of us carry, especially in an age that emphasizes introspection, but often lacks spiritual grounding. We live in a world that encourages analysis, critique, and performance. But without compassion, without a path toward wholeness, that introspection can turn toxic. It can create beautiful minds that eat themselves from the inside out. And so the underground man is not just a warning about intellect, it's a warning about disconnection. From others, yes, but more dangerously, from the self. From the deeper, truer self that exists beneath the ego, beneath the shame, beneath the performance. We've named his patterns now. We see them in our journals, our therapy sessions, our silent struggles. But the question remains. Once you recognize the underground man in yourself, what do you do next? That's where we go from here. What happens when a mind, like the underground man's, becomes a hall of mirrors? When the soul turns inward so completely that it forgets how to live, how to reach, how to trust? The consequences are not just philosophical abstractions. They are deeply human, emotional. They seep into every corner of life, into our relationships, our ambitions, our sense of self, and even our capacity for joy. The underground man lives in a constant state of conflict. He is tormented not by the world outside him, but by the world within. And that's what makes his suffering so difficult to escape. It's not a pain inflicted by others. It's a pain he maintains himself, meticulously, like a shrine to his own failed dignity. Let's look at this through the lens of emotional health. One of the most devastating consequences of the underground man's condition is the collapse of intimacy. Real intimacy, emotional, spiritual, even physical, requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to be seen in our contradictions, our softness, our needs. But for the underground man, this is impossible. Vulnerability is weakness, and weakness is unbearable. He craves closeness but annihilates it the moment it draws near. This is why his encounter with Liza is so heartbreaking. Here is a woman who sees through his mask, who responds not to his intellect but to his woundedness. She offers him empathy, but he cannot receive it. He humiliates her instead, calling her a fool for trying to love him. In truth, he does this because he feels unworthy. Her affection threatens his carefully constructed image of himself as unlovable, and so he proves it to himself again by driving her away. We do this, too, in smaller ways. We ghost people who care too much. We deflect compliments. We keep conversations shallow because deeper truths feel too exposed. We self-sabotage because part of us is more comfortable in familiar pain than in unknown joy. In this way, the underground man becomes a mirror. He reflects back the ways we resist the very love we say we want. But intimacy is only one layer. His condition also devastates his sense of purpose. Because he overanalyzes every potential action, he becomes incapable of choosing a direction. He mocks others for chasing careers, relationships, or ideals, but only because he himself cannot chase anything without unraveling. This is not disinterest. It's despair. Behind his cynicism lies a longing for meaning that he has convinced himself he cannot possess. In our world today, this shows up as paralysis by analysis, especially in younger generations raised on infinite options and relentless self-awareness. When we are told we can be anything, we often end up doing nothing, not because we're lazy, but because each choice feels like the death of all the others. And, like the underground man, we begin to preemptively criticize the very paths we might have taken, mocking them before they can mock us. This leads to isolation, perhaps the deepest wound of all. Not the kind of isolation that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being emotionally unreachable. The underground man speaks, but no one truly hears him. He writes, but only to an imagined audience. He is alive, but untethered. No community, no tradition, no divine presence, just an echo chamber of thought. This mirrors a growing modern phenomenon, the experience of spiritual disconnection. In previous centuries, even when people were tormented, they were often grounded in shared narratives, religion, myth, culture. The suffering had a container, a context. The underground man has none of this. He is a man cut off not just from others, but from the cosmos itself. He cannot pray, not because he lacks belief, but because belief would require surrender. And surrender is something he cannot allow. He must stay in control, even if it kills him. Dostoevsky seems to suggest that such spiritual emptiness is more dangerous than physical suffering, because when there is no higher ground to orient the soul begins to turn against itself. The underground man doesn't just suffer, he corrodes. He rots in his own intellect. He poisons every chance at redemption, because he cannot imagine a world in which grace could reach someone like him. This spiritual vacuum is something we now try to fill with performance, with productivity, with curated digital identities. But the result is often the same, a pervasive sense of inauthenticity, of performing life rather than living it. We edit our feelings, rehearse our interactions, filter our dreams until we no longer recognize what's real. And when authenticity does try to break through, we panic, because like the underground man, we have trained ourselves to distrust it. The most haunting consequence of all, though, is this: the loss of hope. The underground man is not simply bitter. He is hopeless, and not in a dramatic, overt way, but in a quiet, insidious way. His hopelessness is the kind that hides behind sarcasm, behind irony, behind endless cleverness. He pretends to laugh at the world, but really he has already given up on it, on love, on healing, on God, on himself. This brand of despair is especially dangerous because it feels intelligent. It feels like insight, but it is, in truth, a kind of emotional numbness masquerading as wisdom. And it's spreading. Today, many people believe that being disillusioned is a sign of maturity, that optimism is naive, that belief in something greater is foolish. But this is not enlightenment. This is erosion. This is what happens when pain is never transmuted, only rehearsed. Historically, we've seen this before. In myths, the figure of the wounded king or fallen hero often appears, a person who was once whole but has withdrawn into bitterness. In Arthurian legend, the Fisher King is wounded and his kingdom suffers as a result. The land becomes barren, lifeless. Healing only begins when someone dares to ask the right question. In Jungian language, this is the call to confront the shadow, to bring the unconscious into the light. The underground man has no such quest. He has no grail to search for. He does not believe in healing, and so he festers. His life becomes a desert, not because he lacks water, but because he refuses to drink. And perhaps this is Dostoevsky's most powerful warning. When we allow intellect to replace soul, when we mock tenderness to protect pride, when we dismantle meaning in the name of control, we don't become free. We become stuck. We become men and women underground, buried not by the world, but by ourselves. But even here, in this darkness, there is a choice: to continue rehearsing our wounds, or to rise, slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly, toward something greater. And that's where the light begins to enter. The world Dostoevsky feared, the one where man retreats from authenticity into abstraction, has not only arrived, but become normalized. What once was a philosophical warning has now become a digital lifestyle. We have built a new kind of underground, not in cold basements or ink-stained pages, but behind screens, avatars, and endless online performances. The underground man's descent into isolation was a psychological response to disillusionment and humiliation. But today, we often retreat without even knowing it. Our public personas become polished masks. Our inner monologues, though no longer handwritten confessions, are lived through algorithms and scrolling timelines. The question is no longer if we are in the underground, but how deeply. And this is where modern psychology must grapple with new symptoms: narcissistic overcompensation, existential fatigue, and emotional detachment disguised as independence. These are not just personal flaws. They are cultural pathologies, reflections of a society that rewards performance over presence, speed over depth, and consumption over contemplation. In psychological terms, we live in an age of narcissistic wounding, not because we are all narcissists in the clinical sense, but because so many of us have been shaped by environments that value appearance over being. From childhood, we are trained to earn validation, to compete for significance, and to suppress our raw emotions in favor of curated ones. The result? A fragmented self. And this fragmented self behaves eerily like the underground man. It analyzes every interaction, struggles to feel sincere, and secretly doubts the worth of both self and others. Behind the selfies and the success stories, there's often a quiet fear. What if no one ever really sees me? What if I don't even see myself anymore? This is what Carl Jung called the loss of soul, a spiritual emptiness masked by surface activity. We can function perfectly, go to work, laugh at jokes, post beautiful photos, and still feel hollow inside. The underground man lived in that hollow. And today, millions do too, but with brighter lighting and faster Wi-Fi. Even our relationships bear this mark. In a world obsessed with personal branding, love becomes transactional. We fear vulnerability not because it's weak, but because it threatens the curated image. Emotional intimacy is risky. It requires us to dismantle the armor we've spent years constructing. So instead, many opt for performative closeness, text messages that avoid depth, conversations that circle around real feelings, and a kind of ghostly presence in each other's lives. But here's the deeper tragedy. When we deny others access to our true selves, we also deny ourselves the chance to be truly known. We remain unseen and unloved, not because no one cares, but because we never gave them the chance. This emotional starvation leads to what Viktor Frankl called the existential vacuum, a kind of psychological paralysis where one no longer knows what is meaningful. Work becomes empty. Relationships feel draining. And instead of asking, "How do I live a meaningful life?" we ask, "How do I stay distracted enough to forget I'm not living one?" Dostoevsky saw this coming. He understood that when man loses a sense of sacredness, of moral grounding, of community, of suffering that means something, he will either fall into despair or build a false world to hide inside. The underground man did both. And today, our false worlds are elaborate, filled with productivity hacks, dopamine-driven apps, endless entertainment, and toxic positivity masquerading as mental health advice. But there's another layer to this crisis. The underground man was, at his core, terrified of freedom. He mocked it, dismissed it, and eventually rejected it. Why? Because freedom means responsibility. And responsibility means we can no longer blame the world, the past, or other people for our suffering. It means that to heal, we must stop rehearsing our pain and start creating something new. Modern culture often sells us the illusion of freedom. Do what you want, be who you are, break all the rules, but it rarely teaches us the discipline that freedom requires. True freedom isn't chaotic. It isn't found in indulgence or rebellion. It is found in knowing who you are and living in alignment with that, even when it's difficult. This is where existentialist thinkers like Kierkegaard and Sartre overlap with Jung and even ancient spiritual traditions. Freedom without purpose leads to despair. The underground man has no purpose. He lives only in negation. He knows what he doesn't want, but not what he does. And without a yes to life, even the strongest no will collapse into emptiness. So, how do we recover a yes? It begins with meaning. Not grand, abstract meaning, but personal meaning. What stirs your heart, even if it scares you? What would you still care about, even if no one applauded? What values feel worth suffering for? Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your truest self, requires descent into the unconscious. You must face your shadows, integrate your contradictions, and step beyond inherited scripts. The underground man failed because he refused to suffer meaningfully. He suffered aimlessly, bitterly, without transformation. But suffering, when chosen with courage, becomes sacred. It purifies, it teaches, it opens, and perhaps, most importantly, it connects. When we embrace our own depths, we become more capable of meeting others in theirs. So, if you're living with quiet despair, trapped in your own endless inner monologue, know this. The way out isn't to escape your mind. It's to go deeper until you find the bottom, and then rise from it. This is not easy. It requires more than self-help slogans. It demands inner revolution. But it is possible, and you don't need to do it alone. Every great transformation in history, from Buddha Yu awakening beneath the Bodhi tree to Dostoevsky, Esa's own spiritual rebirth in a Siberian prison, began with a confrontation, with pain, with death, with ego, and every one of them ended in a greater light. The underground is not your grave. It's your chrysalis. So ask yourself, gently but honestly, have I been using intelligence to avoid intimacy? Have I built a life of freedom without meaning? And what might change if I stopped performing and simply let myself be? You don't need all the answers, just a deeper question, and the courage to ask it out loud. If the underground man is Dostoevsky's haunting mirror of what happens when we recoil too far into ourselves, then our task is not to escape introspection, but to redeem it. The aim is not to destroy the intellect, but to reroot it in something deeper: compassion, purpose, integration. Healing does not come from thinking more sharply, but from learning how to feel more courageously. So how do we begin to climb out of the underground? How do we soften the reflexes of cynicism and self-sabotage without falling into delusion? Let's begin with the most challenging but essential shift: moving from awareness to acceptance. Modern psychology emphasizes the power of radical acceptance, a concept rooted in dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. This practice doesn't mean we approve of everything we've done or felt. It means we stop resisting our reality long enough to change it. The underground man is hyper-aware, yes, but he refuses to accept himself. He observes every impulse with disdain. But what if he simply noticed without judgment? What if we did? This is where mindfulness becomes vital, not as a trendy concept, but as a lived discipline. Mindfulness is the ability to sit with yourself without flinching, to witness your anger, jealousy, fear, or shame and say, "I see you." Not to fix it instantly, not to analyze it to death, just to hold it. A simple practice. Each morning or evening, sit for 10 minutes. No phone, no music, just you and your breath. And ask, what am I resisting right now? Let the answer come, not from the thinking mind, but from the body. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's the need to be liked. Maybe it's the simple ache of being alive. Let it be there. You don't need to exile any part of yourself. Another powerful tool is self-compassion, as developed by psychologist Kristin Neff. Many of us confuse self-compassion with weakness, just as the underground man did. But self-compassion is not indulgence, it's accountability without cruelty. It means saying, yes, I failed, yes, I'm flawed, but I still deserve care. Without self-compassion, introspection becomes a weapon. With it, reflection becomes healing. If the underground man had allowed himself even one moment of tenderness toward himself, just one breath of forgiveness, his entire story might have changed. And yours can too. Let's turn now to journaling, not as a way to perform insight, but to deepen it. Often, we journal as if we're writing for an audience. The underground man did this. His words were aimed at imagined readers who might pity or admire his despair. But real journaling is private, raw, unedited. It's the art of seeing yourself clearly, without the need to explain or impress. Try these prompts. What truth about myself have I been avoiding? What pain have I made part of my identity? Who would I be if I believed I was worthy of love? What do I gain by staying stuck? Write without censoring. Let it be messy. This isn't about crafting a narrative. It's about cracking it open. But self-reflection alone isn't enough. Healing also requires embodied practices, ways to get out of your head and into your life. The underground man is disembodied. He lives entirely in abstraction. So we must do the opposite. Start with something physical and simple. A walk, a cold shower, even 10 push-ups. Not to punish the body, but to return to it. Movement grounds us. It reminds us that we exist beyond thought. The body, unlike the mind, does not lie. It breathes, it aches, it loves, it remembers. Reconnecting with it helps silence the endless monologue of inner criticism. Therapy is another essential practice, especially trauma-informed approaches that explore the roots of emotional avoidance and self-sabotage. Working with a skilled therapist can help you trace how early experiences shaped your defense mechanisms, and more importantly, how to unlearn them. Therapy doesn't give you answers. It gives you space to ask the real questions, the kind that don't fit neatly into language. But we must also address something deeper than psychology. We must address the soul. The underground man suffers from spiritual starvation. He has no inner altar, no sacred practice, no God to pray to, not even a silence to bow before. This is more common today than we realize, and it doesn't matter whether you're religious, spiritual, but not religious, or simply curious. What matters is whether you make room in your life for the sacred. This could mean daily prayer, if that's meaningful to you. Or it might be meditation, or reading mystical texts, or simply sitting under the sky in stillness. The goal is not to believe in something dogmatic. The goal is to remember that your life has more depth than your thoughts, that you are not just a bundle of nerves and neuroses. You are also wonder, mystery, breath. In Sufi wisdom, there's a saying, "There is a voice that doesn't use words. Listen." The underground man never listened, but we still can. Now, perhaps the most radical practice of all, connection. The very thing the underground man feared is the thing that saves us. Other people, imperfect, frustrating, beautiful people, you cannot heal in isolation. We need friendships that allow for realness. We need mentors, lovers, community, not to fix us, but to remind us we're not alone. And this doesn't mean forcing shallow socializing. It means risking small acts of honesty, saying how you really feel, asking for help, admitting when you're scared. Vulnerability is not a loss of dignity. It is dignity made human. And every time we let someone see us, we defy the lie that says we must stay underground. Finally, consider this. Art, write poetry, make music, paint, dance, not because you're good at it, but because creation is the opposite of despair. The underground man created nothing. He destroyed. But creation, even in its simplest form, reconnects us to life. So, no, there is no quick fix. No formula to undo years of cynicism, fear, and emotional solitude. But there is a path. It winds slowly, through silence, softness, courage, and connection. And it begins with a decision, a quiet one, to stop rehearsing the wound, to begin living the question, to rise. At the end of Notes from Underground, there is no redemption arc, no heroic transformation. The underground man remains buried beneath his own mind, his last words trailing off mid-thought. He doesn't find peace, nor does he truly want it. And that, perhaps, is Dostoevsky's final warning. If we do not challenge the beliefs that keep us underground, we will stay there. Not because the world has locked us in, but because we have thrown away the key. But here's the truth that Dostoevsky leaves between the lines. The underground man is not a monster. He is not evil or beyond saving. He is just afraid. Afraid to love. Afraid to hope. Afraid to trust anything he cannot fully control. And in that fear, he reflects a part of each of us, the part that would rather retreat than risk. The part that builds walls not to keep others out, but to stop ourselves from feeling too much. And yet, if we can recognize that part, we are no longer ruled by it. You see, there is a subtle turning point hidden in this whole journey. The moment you stop romanticizing your suffering. The moment you stop performing your pain. The moment you realize that intelligence without compassion is just another form of despair. That moment, however small, is sacred. It is the beginning of a new narrative. One that does not deny your wounds, but also does not worship them. When we reread Notes from Underground with this in mind, something beautiful emerges. Not just a critique of society, not just a psychological case study, but an invitation to see yourself clearly, to soften, to begin again. You are not required to stay buried in your own mind. You are not doomed to replay the same conversations with imaginary adversaries. You are not unlovable because you failed or felt too much. You are, in fact, human. And being human means being messy, feeling deeply, contradicting yourself, and still choosing day by day to walk toward the light. The underground man didn't know how to choose that path, but you can. And maybe that's the quiet power of Dostoevsky's genius. Not that he offered answers, but that he held up a mirror. And in that mirror, if you look closely enough, you don't just see despair. You see the possibility of courage, of transformation, of stepping out into the world, not as someone who has it all figured out, but as someone who has finally stopped hiding. So, let me leave you with this question. What if the parts of you that you've buried, the shame, the doubt, the fear, were not signs of weakness, but doorways? What if the underground wasn't a prison, but a passage? And what if the only thing left to do was to rise? If this exploration of the underground man stirred something within you, don't just close this video and scroll to the next distraction. Pause. Let what you've felt settle in. Because awareness, as powerful as it is, means little without action. And this moment, right now, is an opportunity to step out of the emotional isolation so many of us live in, often without realizing it. So I invite you, not as an expert, but as a fellow traveler, to take the next step. Maybe it starts with journaling honestly, not beautifully. Maybe it's reaching out to someone you've emotionally distanced yourself from, or finally starting therapy, or even just sitting quietly with your thoughts without trying to escape them. And if you found truth in this message, if it reflected some corner of your inner life, then share this video. Because someone else, right now, might be trapped in their own underground, and your share might be the signpost that helps them surface. We don't heal alone, and part of dismantling the illusion of isolation is speaking up, even in small ways. Leave a comment below, something real. Tell me, what are you done hiding from? What's your first step out of the underground? Not for likes, not for applause. Just to remind yourself that you're still capable of vulnerability and still deserving of connection. Subscribe if you want more content that doesn't sugarcoat the human experience, but explores it, messy, honest, and deep. This space isn't for performance. It's for transformation. And every time you come back, I hope you feel a little less alone in your thoughts. Because here's the truth. The world doesn't need more perfectly curated people. It needs more people willing to be seen. So start where you are. Begin imperfectly. And remember, there's nothing wrong with you for having struggled. But there is something beautiful about choosing, even once, to rise. You've already taken the first step by watching this far. Don't let it end here.